Podcasts, an in-depth episode-by-episode guide, analysis and celebration of England's most beloved and successful sitcom. To find out more about the show, contact us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. Lovely jubbly. Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Only Fools and Podcasts, where we celebrate and analyse the world's most favourite sitcom. Right, here we are, folks. We are at the difficult second album. Hopefully you've listened to the first episode, hopefully you've enjoyed that, and you're here to see whether I can keep up the momentum. And you know what, let me just start this episode by giving a massive thanks to the overwhelmingly positive response that I've gotten for the first episode so far. It's not, as of recording, it's actually not on iTunes yet, so it's only been on YouTube, Reddit, and a couple of the smaller podcast hosting sites. But regardless, I just want to say that I really appreciate it, and it's a great motivational tool to keep the show on track and just to allow me to keep doing episodes, because I really enjoy doing it, and I'm glad you do too. As before, if you want to get in contact with the show, email us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com, with any stories that you have about the show, how you got into it, any trivia, or even, heaven forbid, if you think I've gotten something wrong and you want to discuss that. You can also follow us on the Twitter at onlyfoolspod, which I've just started to pick up followers on, and it's really fun gathering all the content to keep it active and alive. So, before we dive right into episode 2 of season 1, Go West Young Man, we're going to keep in with the educational, in quotation marks, educational nature of the show. So this week I thought we would talk about the show's most famous-ist character. We are, of course, going to discuss the character of Derek Del Boy Trotter. So, who is Del? Well, Del, if you have to ask anyone on the street who is your favourite Only Fools and Horses character, 9 out of 10 people are going to pick Del Boy. David Jason's portrayal of the character just oozes this endless and totally all-encompassing charm that means he's utterly irresistible. All the biggest quotes from the show all come from him, all the classic moments involve him, and pretty much all the best storylines, at least for the early half, will involve Del. You could argue that the Rodney and Cassandra plotline does become more prominent as the show goes on, but when you think of Only Fools and Horses, you think of Del Boy. But why do people love this character? It's mostly because he is likeable. It's a bit of a cop-out answer, but that's really it. Despite all of his flaws and his preoccupations with machoism and wheeling and dealing and ripping people off, people can just relate to Del, because not only does he have this tragic backstory of losing his mom and having to raise his younger brother, it's just his pure British gumption and his endless motivation and his can-do attitude and his ability to not be a victim, to not let life get him down and just carry on slogging whilst smiling, whilst creating a happy environment for everyone. He's always buying other people drinks, he's making sure no one's out of pocket, doing people deals, he's always doing good deeds. And whilst he doesn't always save the cat every episode, so to speak, he's always kind enough. We always know that his motivations are pure. We know that he doesn't really have a bad bone in his body, and whilst he might do morally questionable things, it's all in the end goal of trying to make a better life for his family. And why do I like Del so much? I like Del purely because of his cheekiness. He's scrappy, and just the writing that goes around him. As I've said, Del Boy will get the lion's share of all the best lines and quotes from this show, and he is written almost perfectly. And whilst you wouldn't associate Del so much as the character with the most running jokes, he does have enough quirks and that you can both appreciate him as a new viewer to the show and as a long-running fan. In a way, Del is the ultimate male role model in the show. A lot of the audience can come into the programme through Rodney's eyes. He's the younger brother, he is the more modern character. He's the one who's still learning the world around him. And all he really has is Del, and we view the world as Del presents it to Rodney. We have to learn with him, and despite a lot of our reservations of what Del does, it is his experience and the fact that he does get down in the nitty-gritty and work all the time. It does mean that he is right more often than not. When we see Del at the start of the show, he's around 35, so he's coming up to middle age, but he's still got that youthful exuberance about him, and whilst the character doesn't really change per se, he always remains Del Boy as we kind of love him. And whilst characters in sitcoms like this can't necessarily grow too much, as the character will become rather unidentifiable and different, and not what we love about the show. We do see Del gain somewhat an emotional and a psychological maturity. You know, he does start to settle down with Raquel. We will see him have a child with her, all while still retaining all the things that make us love Del. Especially that David Jason's primary inspiration for the character of Del Boy came from a person he had encountered during his time as a jobbing electrician. He and his partner, during a rather tumultuous time in their business, I think it was called B&W Installations, they sent out hundreds of these sort of just welcome letters that were just advertising the business, you know, trying to gain some custom. And the first man to respond was a bloke named Derek Hockley. As David Jason described him, Derek Hockley had a little goatee beard and was terribly well turned out. He had a clean shirt that was immaculately pressed, a sharp suit, all the jewellery, highly polished shoes, and a camel hair coat. And he just looked the business. What I couldn't get out of my mind was a guy looking as elegantly dressed as he did, yet he spoke in a gore-blimey Cockney accent. He was a great character, a real ducker and diver, and it really left an impression on me. This David Hockley character actually reminds me somewhat of the Matthew Vaughn film, Kingsman, The Secret Service. I think it's Colin Firth's character, but Hockley makes this remark of, "Clothes maketh the man." And it's this axiom that is very obvious in Del. He does live by that motto to the full. To me, Del has always come across as this guy that, whilst not being totally honest with himself about his shortcomings in his life outside of his business, you know, he's not the most well-read guy, he's not the most educated chap. So, in a way, he's kind of been forced to show off in more flashy and more obvious ways. The Trotters have always been on the poorer end of the spectrum, and whilst he isn't ashamed of this, per se, he will take the opportunity to take pride in showing off any financial achievements that his family has made through his wardrobe. David Jason also affected some of Hockley's mannerisms, including a certain jerky little movement when he bobs his head back and forth through his, as if his collar's uncomfortable. It's like, yeah, Rodders, yeah, like he sort of lightly bobs his head like a bird. And little things like that just go to make Del this fully realised 3D character. Quoting from Only Fools and Horses, The Inside Story by Steve Clark, David Jason also cites another inspiration for the character of Del, which hints at the idea that, Del being the show's common man is actually an amalgamation of all sorts of common men, which is just perfect, really. One of the inspirations for Del was a guy I knew named Chicky Stocker. He was a working-class Londoner and a tough man, but always dressed neatly. He was very genuine, and I liked his attitude to life. He was very loyal to his family, and I tried to instill that in Del. Other aspects of his character, like buying drinks for people down the pub, even when he really couldn't afford to, came from people I knew in the car trade. They always wanted to keep face, borrowing money to flash about and wearing lots of gold rings. He goes on to say, "I'd seen it so many times with the guys who fancied themselves. They develop a certain body language that's supposed to attract birds, I suppose. It's like a signal that says, I'm the business, look at me, I'm the cat's whiskers, I've got style, I've got class." The classic look that we know of Del Boy actually went through several revisions and redesigns to get the sort of instantly recognisable look that we all know and love now. Sullivan himself had this vision of him having like rings on every finger and being a bit more garish and tacky, and the costume designer for the show, Phoebe de Gay, saw him sporting these weird long sideburns as to suggest the smell of brute aftershave and cheap hair oil. However, I think it's rather lucky that David Jason was rather resistant to anything too garish in that sense, and wanted the character to be, less comical in his appearance and more in his words, and to be a little more reserved. Physical abnormality is kind of a cheap comedic route, so to make Del look more normal as this common man is more than fitting, really. What they came to was the classically tacky big gold chain, but a couple of rings here and there that he'll constantly refer to and pawn when necessary, as well as the big chunky bracelet. Then, after several varied shopping trips around clothing retailers in the London area where Del Boy would have lived, they fortunately stumbled across the very unconventional sheepskin coat and flat cap. The sideburns, fortunately, eventually became just a cute little quiff that would eventually recede as Del aged. But in these earlier episodes, it is clear to see that Del, in his vanity, is very caught up in his hair. He's always in front of the mirror and that kind of thing. So it does make sense that he does have more of a hairstyle in these earlier episodes. And luckily, the episode that we're just about to dive into is one where Del has to look flash. He has to look good, as Del's desire to look successful and flash is essential in his ability to attract partners, whether that's business partners or romantic ones. So let's dive right into episode 2 of season 1 of Only Fools and Horses, Go West Young Man. So once again, the opening shot of the episode starts on Grandad's 2 TVs as we pan across the grubby, cluttered flat to see Del and Rodney slumped at the table. Rodney again is looking depressed, staring off into the distance. Del is busy reading a second-hand car magazine and claims their future is in the second-hand car game. This is also the first time we ever hear Del cite the classic line, "This time next year we'll be millionaires." Del here doesn't notice, or chooses not to notice, Rodney's comment that he dreamt he was drowning the night before. Then Del goes into rather specific political detail as to, thanks to union and import-export problems, why Britain's future lies in the second-hand car game. And I do like this moment more than I probably would have picked up on earlier, but it does give the scene a definite time and place within the 1980s. And all whilst throughout this, Rodney actually confesses to Del that he dreamt he was drowning the night before, but Del either misses this or just chooses to miss it, before suddenly realising that he actually heard Rodney mention this rather weird dream. And he asks him if it's just a subtle bedwetting reference. In reply, Rodney confesses that he's pretty depressed. However, Del downplays this a little as he knows the real reason why. It turns out Rodney's down all because of a bird, and Del tries to give him some simple advice on how to get her back and move past Rodney's typical stubborn pride. Rodney mentions Mickey Pearce for the first time here, as it was Mickey Pearce who advised Rodney to go on this trial separation with Monica in the first place. Whilst Del and Rodney then argue over whether Monica has fat thighs or not, Del actually mentions that he saw her dancing at a club with said Mickey Pearce, sending Rodney into a rather stunned embarrassment, much to Del's humour. Del then pretty much tells Rodney to pack his bags and get ready to come out to go to work that day. Del then leaves, with Rodney swiftly following behind, presumably to find out more about Mickey Pearce. So there's a little moment here where Rodney talks about drowning in his dream, and for me it mirrors somewhat of Dustin Hoffman's young character in the film The Graduate, where there are many overt references to drowning. His head is framed within a fish tank, there's lots of shots of him underwater, and this sense of drowning in a sort of post-educational malaise is something that it does transfer from both a young American character to a young British character, film and TV also, and shows that it must be a rather common feeling amongst young men. And like I said, this is the first time we hear of the character Mickey Pearce, yet we do not actually see him, which somewhat leads me to believe that maybe, at first at least, that the character was originally meant to be one of the many unseen faces of Only Fools and Horses that the Trotters will refer to, names like Paddy the Greek or Monkey Harris or Iggy Higgins. And although we don't see him at all, we do establish a lot of things that makes Mickey Mickey. We set up the rather playful, if somewhat cruel, rivalry between the sly Mickey and the kinder Rodney. Mickey will tend to exploit Rodney's softer nature. And we learn that Mickey is also a very devious character as well, a very conniving one. Later we'll even learn that he would even steal from his own grandmother. But more on him in another episode. This also won't be the first time that Rodney will seem to have trouble with the ladies, and whilst this episode does need to explain a lot of this exposition, it will become a running arc in Rodney's story that he just isn't that good with the ladies. And it will nicely culminate with him and Cassandra's marriage. This is also another moment where Rodney also does not pay much attention to the rather sound advice that Del Boy will give him. It again highlights the fact that despite Del's years of experience over him, Rodney does still indeed think that he knows best, despite only having 2 GCEs. I do rather enjoy Rodney's sort of younger, stroppy phase here. It just really highlights the youthfulness of his character, and it does allow a rather typically good character like Rodney to show that he isn't always the perfect, sensible moral compass either. Then we cut to an opening on a car with the sound of a character whose voice we haven't heard before. It turns out it's Boycie, one of Del's old school friends, and he's attempting to sell Del a rather naff second-hand car, which came in with a consignment of presumably other hooky goods. And whilst Del is interested in the second-hand car game, the car in question, as Del puts it, is in fact a bit of a pig. Rodney tries to be smart and funny here by pointing out that there's 98,000 miles on the clock, which results in Del telling him to shut up. Then, when Boycie asks, well, what do you want for 50 quid, Del begins drooling over the Jag parked behind. Boycie explains to Del that the car is actually for his bit on the side, a phrase which rather confuses the green Rodney. Del, suddenly remembering that he has a spare garage for the van, offers to look after the car for Boycie so that word about his affair doesn't get out. In return, Boycie will do him a deal on the car that Del was eyeing up. So, in the last scene, we were introduced to Mickey Pearce purely by mention alone, But in this scene, we're 2 episodes in, and already, bam, we're introduced to one of the biggest characters in the show, a character so big and so popular with his very famous laugh that he will in fact get his own spin-off series that will run for several seasons. Of course, I'm talking about Boycie. Again, like Mickey Pearce though in this episode, even though Boycie has his classic look here, he has the moustache, the cigars, the big coats, the flash suits, despite all of this, like Mickey Pearce, it might be safe to say that Boycie may have just been conceived as another one of those one-off characters that they may never have referred to again. You know, this show never knew whether it was going to get a second season or not. And there's not really much reference to Boycie's wider character within the Only Fools universe. They don't mention that they went to school together, as it's only really just a short cameo. What is interesting here, though, is that Boycie is portrayed typically as a friend. He is seen to be Del's friend. They seem to get along fine. There's no mention of Marlene by name yet, even though we do establish that he is married, if somewhat rather unfaithful. We also see right away that he, whilst being, as dodgy as Del Boy himself, has a much steadier job and is much more well off. But it's interesting how in the very next episode, where we see Boycie next in season 2, he will jump from this, position of real friendship and warmth with Del to becoming an actual antagonist and villain, which is something that's really not hinted at enough here. As Boycie's actions in the poker game do seem to stick out a bit, do seem to awkwardly stick out within the canon of Only Fools and Horses, especially considering that, we do find out that they were old school friends. This is also the first time we visit Boycie's showroom as well, which pretty much changes every time you see it. It is interesting though, purely because it is Boycie's showroom, where in Time on Our Hands, Del and Rodney reveal their newfound riches for the very first time to anyone, which essentially turns the head on the whole Del-Boycie dynamic that we're introduced to here. Del in this scene also offers to pay Boycie in the old readies, which is the only time this phrase is ever mentioned in the show, which we have mentioned means cold hard cash, and was the original working title for the show before it was titled Only Fools and Horses. This scene also is just a great highlight of Del's quick-witted ability to improvise on the spot, put 2 and 2 together, make a deal, and always seemingly come out on top. It's actually rather effortless when you watch it. We then cut to a rarely seen location. It's not like it doesn't exist, like that weird rec room in the Simpsons house that we never see, but here we do get to see Del's lock-up garage. He's just locking away the E-Type Jag, keeping it safe, and then Del swiftly turns around to hear this screeching wail of tyres that are rapidly approaching. It's Rodney in the car that Boycie had also just sold them for looking after the Jag. Rodney attempts to slam the brake and panics as it really doesn't work, but eventually just comes to a screeching halt as he whizzes past Del. Rodney is understandably very cross here and bemoans Del for buying a death trap. However, Del snarkily replies with, "Well, what do you expect for 25 quid? So clearly Del's managed to haggle Boycie down through the favour by 50% on the cost of the crappy second-hand car, obviously for doing the favour. It should be worth mentioning here that, with thanks to the Bank of England's really nifty online inflation calculator, that 25 quid, which is a rather small paltry sum by today's standards, that might be about $31, that back in 1980, £25 was actually much closer to the value of £100, £96.70 specifically, I believe. This is also the garage that we know that the famous Harrison timepiece is being stored in. I'd love to think that Sullivan again is dangling this little tragically ironic thread in front of us, intentionally to show us just how close they would come so early on to actually becoming millionaires, if only they knew to look in the right places. It's also interesting to see the fact that the first vehicle we see Rodney drive is not the classic 3-wheeled van, but the Death Trap motor. Then we cut to outside the Nelson Mandela house, a little cardboard sign that Del has just placed on the car, valuing it at £199, which is a steep market, giving it a value of around £769.73. Thank you again to the Bank of England inflation calculator. Rodney clambers into the car to enjoy a nice cup of tea, but before it comes to his mouth, the back end of the car starts uncontrollably bouncing up and down, and it's revealed to be a potential buyer. A bald, irascible Aussie with a little moustache who appears rather uninterested in the purchase, no thanks to Rodney's rather poor salesmanship skills. That is until Del shows up, who then proceeds to lie out of his 2 front teeth to do whatever he can to sell this horrible car, claiming everything from the car having to undergo a 500-mile MOT test, and that the rare African gazelle actually went extinct purely for the upholstery of the vehicle. Dell then tries to compliment the Aussie with that sly salesman technique by saying, I can tell you're a real enthusiast. I can tell you know what you're talking about, which doesn't sit down well with the man. He reacts rather hostily, claiming that he's able to make up his own mind and doesn't need a cockney villain. After pointing out some of the optional extras, such as the 1-speed wiper and automatic collapsing windows, the Aussie inquires as to how many previous owners the vehicle had. Dell then fakes that the last owner and only owner was actually a vicar who only drove it once a week back and forth to church, sealing the deal by happening to check the glove compartment and stumbling across an apparent left Bible. So again, the scenes where we see Del Boy in the marketplace, it is just great. See him do what he does best, which is sell. And the real charm that David Jason brings to a role like this is what allows this to transcend. We, ironically, as the audience, we know what he's selling is terrible, but regardless, we still see that he really probably could sell anything to anyone. He does exude that charm and that joy, and he does make you want to buy whatever he's selling. This also won't be the first run-in Del actually has with Australians either, as he'll be tempted to move there by his old business acquaintance Jumbo Mills in the season 5 finale Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Although oddly enough, and this is something I literally just picked up on whilst watching the episode doing the research for this show, the actor who plays Jumbo Mills is the same actor who plays this Aussie who buying the car from Del in this scene, in a rather odd, rare moment for the show of reusing the same actor in a different role. And I really can't believe I didn't spot it soon, if I'm honest. Del also makes a comment that the English and Australians are cousins, which also rather humorously lends itself to the fact that Del and Rodney will constantly get mistaken for Australians in Miami twice. This is also the second cup of tea in 2 episodes now in a row that this show has now interrupted comedically. Hopefully it won't be too long before we actually do get to see someone in the show drink a cup of tea. I know, it's very tense. We also get a look at another of Del's faux French phrases, as he describes the car as being sonnette lumière, which roughly translates to sound and light. Then we swiftly fade into the flat as we see Del counting the cash that he's just earned from selling the car. Again, an 800% profit no less. Del then starts to cite a rather funny little old rhyme. As I was walking through Earl's Court, into a pub I was lured, where a nosy pom said, "Where you from?" as I downed the amber fluid. I said, "Get it straight, I'm an Aussie mate, and I'm fixing to get plastered. But the beer is crook, and the birds all look like you pommy, Grandad." And I'm sure we could all guess what the other word was supposed to be here. I just have to say, honestly, this moment always gets a little laugh from me, because he does just seem to come out of nowhere, and Del never really does something like that again. And whilst the two Ronnies rather famously had whole sketches where they would just set up dirty limericks and avoid the swear word, this, in the fact that it's not used that often, does allow it to be a little funnier than maybe it would be if they reuse this kind of humour over and over, as it is just a rather easy way to titillate an audience who wouldn't be allowed to view swearing before the watershed. It should be noted at this time that the Earl's Court area of London actually did rather famously have a large Australian population, so Del selling this car to an Australian in this episode isn't that unlike. Del asks Grandad about where Rodney is, but Grandad claims he's still pining over Monica. Whilst on the subject of women, Del and Grandad discuss a very strange old story where Grandad describes a rather odd sexual encounter he had with Del's grandmother, whereby she asked him halfway through copulation or intercourse what he would like for dinner tomorrow. It turns out he wanted steak and kidney pudding. Then in comes Rodney, who says he's going out to essentially get back at Monica for going out with Mickey Pierce. He's going to go on the lash, go on and paint the town red. And Del pretty much laughs at this idea straight away. Rodney claims to be going out west to the more trendier bars with his long list of friends and pubs he would like to frequent. Of course, Del typically doesn't believe him, and neither do we, as Del says. 2 halves a lager at the British Legion is a walk on the wild side for Rodney. And, even though this is only the second episode in, Rodney has at no point in the show come across as someone who's particularly popular, cool, or trendy. Rodney then sees all the money that Del was counting for the car that he just sold and begins moralistically berating Del for selling such an obvious death trap. However, when it comes to the matter of Rodney's payment, Del is quick to point out that Rodney typically is quick to lose his morality. Rodney then, seeing Del's reaction to this, realises that he does need to stick to said morals here and does decline what he calls Del's blood money. Then he does swiftly kind of realise that if he hasn't got any friends and he hasn't got any money, he is going to have to try and convince Del to come out with him. He then awkwardly feigns leaving several times in a very dramatic fashion before Del finally takes pity and grabs his coat. Del Boy then mentions that they'll have to drive up west to the trendy bars in the three-wheeled van, which almost puts Rodney off going out at all, really. Then Del has the brilliant idea of going up in Boycie's Jag. Then Rodney rather half-heartedly tries to moralise, almost for the sake of it, the idea of doing such a deed, before not so subtly putting all the blame on Del should it go wrong, and enthusiastically getting behind the idea. Del then realises Rodney may have been playing him all along and chases him out of the room. So this is another fun little scene. This is the first of many scenes where Del will mock the outfit of Rodney before a night out, the most notable being Rodney's monochromatic suit in T for 3. We also establish another long-running gag that Rodney is only morally superior to Del when it doesn't affect him financially, especially since Del, does control most of the finances for the partnership, even though Rodney is the financial advisor. And the fact that Rodney does flip-flop a lot in this way almost makes him morally inferior to Del. Del cites this as being typical behaviour for young student types as well. He does know that this is Rodney's weakness, and it'll be interesting to see just how many times he will tempt Rodney over and over in this exact way over the course of the show. So we cut to the lads in their first bar of the evening, and it looks pretty dead. Del inquires as to why Rodney's regular, as he claimed, seems to be so dead at this time of the evening. Rodney then confesses that by regular he actually meant he'd never been to the bar before at all. Then the waiter approaches and the two brothers immediately pick up on his effeminate nature. Del, in his rather showy nature, orders a horrifically and incredibly complicated cocktail, whereas Rodney shows him up somewhat by just ordering a plain half a lager. Once the waiter leaves, Del signals to Rodney that he may not be the type of bloke that they typically associate with. And whilst the waiter is fetching the drinks, Rodney confesses to Del, after some persuasion, that the reason he and Monica broke up in the first place was because they didn't totally mesh sexually. Basically, Rodney tells Del that he has a little fetish for uniforms. He's turned on by women in uniforms, especially police women, and that essentially Monica wasn't up for it. Del doesn't react too well to this and thinks Rodney a little perverse, but Rodney then retorts by claiming that what's truly perverse is Del selling a death trap car. Del somewhat concedes to this and promises that he'll get the brakes fixed for the Aussie tomorrow. The waiter then comes back to drop off the drinks. Del complains about the club's unusual prices and tells him and the barman to get stuffed after some further quippy comments at Del's expense. Rodney then spots two feminine figures with long hair at the bar and convinces Del to go over and talk to them. Del being Del, he does exactly that. After swiftly returning, he tells an excited Rodney to drink up and that they'll now be leaving. Rodney, interprets this as being something very good, and he's very happy at the prospect that they're going to be off with these two girls, but he doesn't understand why Del isn't also as joyous. Then Del reveals that the two girls at the bar are actually guys at the bar. The two, shocked that they have wound up in a gay bar, flee the scene immediately. So, yeah, okay, we've got to address the elephant in the room for this episode. Whenever you go back and watch a TV show from a different time, this is 36 years old now at the time of recording, and there are going to be certain elements that won't gel socially through modern lenses. So, yes, this is the episode where there is a certain amount of gay humour and humour at the expense of gay people. Now, straight away, is the hot topic, is it offensive? Is it? And it is hard to say. I certainly don't find any of it particularly inflammatory, but from what I can tell, there is clearly no malice involved in the writing. At no point do Del and Rodney condemn or admonish any of the characters in the gay bar. For example, the punchline is not that there are men that are gay, or that there are men in drag. The punchline is that Del and Rodney are so blinded by their own bickering that they didn't even pick up on it in the first place. Yes, Rodney, in his rather youthful inexperience, especially sexual inexperience, is a little nervous when left alone with the two patrons, but I couldn't imagine the same for Del at all. He knows everyone and has such a wide customer base and is liked by so many people that I doubt he would have any objections to gay people at all. I mean, yes, Del does make a comment about dancing with their backs to the wall, which is probably a contender for the Stuff Del Boy Couldn't Get Away With in 2016 award, but I've heard a lot worse on British TV. Is it completely comfortable to watch? Not entirely. And it can feel a little cheap and corny when compared to modern TV shows and modern interpretations of gay people. But I'm hard pressed to actually find anything really objectionable here. And I can still see what the humour was going for, and admit that it mostly still is rather funny. This is also the scene that begins the inception of Rodney's uniform fetish, which would be constantly referred to throughout much of the show's run, including Rodney dating an actual police officer in The Long Legs of the Law, and Cassandra somewhat indulging Rodney's little preference in the special If They Could See Us Now, where she dresses up as a policewoman and Rodney dresses up as Russell Crowe from Gladiator. So after they swiftly leave the last bar, we find them in the next place they presumably stumbled into, and we find them looking pretty defeated, deep in drink, probably to steady their nerves. Del is rather worried for the sake of his macho image and threatens Rodney not to tell anyone. Rodney apologises, stating that he didn't even know it was that type of bar, which again shows his inexperience on the nightclub scene really. He doesn't even really know London at all. Rodney then spots two more rather suitable suitors in the corner, and Del reluctantly trusts him that they aren't indeed two more blokes this time. Before they approach them, Rodney implores Del that they should just be themselves, and Del shouldn't put Rodney down to big himself up in front of them. Del acquiesces to this, but only if Rodney refuses to mention that Del is in fact 35. They make their way over to the two ladies, and after, the rather friendly initial introductions, the ever relatable awkward silence in between flirts begins to set in. To break the silence, Del claims that Rodney is a famous international tennis player and that he is his coach. However, during the cross-referencing, it's clear that Del and Rodney know sod all about tennis, again, much to the humour of the two girls. After the laugh, Del then confesses that instead they are Concorde pilots. I do like this scene purely because it's one of the rare moments that we get to see the two brothers on the classic pull. Whilst we do get to see them both go through the trials and tribulations of the dating world in their own respects in later episodes, this is one of the only times that I can think of where we get to see their joint dating dynamic, and they do play off each other perfectly, with Del being totally brash and upfront, and Rodney being rather quietly upstaged by dopily sitting on the sidelines. This is their classic formula. This is the characters. This is exactly how we would expect them to act in this type of situation, and it is hilarious to see it unfold. I do wonder though whether Rodney's dislike of Del's tall tales in terms of dating is more of an aversion to lying to women to get them into bed, or whether he's just tired of seeing Del being Del in this type of situation. Del is the snake oil persuasive salesman again, only now this time rather than selling crap on a market corner, he's selling himself, and perhaps Rodney just wants to see Del switching off for a moment. I do also appreciate the hilarious irony in the fact that Del and Rodney did not discuss a game plan before approaching the girls, which leads to them humorously having clashing stories, but more likely than not, it's this confusion between the two of them that may have just been viewed on the part of the women as just a charming little game that leads them to liking them enough to get their phone numbers at all. Perhaps neither Del nor Rodney's approach alone would have been enough to woo either of these two maidens. We also get another reference to Rodney's drug use, as he's asked whether he prefers grass or astroturf, replying that he's never actually smoked astroturf. These are fun little references that aren't in your face, keeping it still family friendly, but still highlighting a rather real underlying contemporary drug issue. Swiftly we leave the bar and we cut to the two brothers sat in the front of Boycie's Jag with huge dirty grins on their faces. Del is driving and he asks Rodney to light his cigar for him, as they plan to celebrate, for they have indeed struck gold that night. Rodney throws away the packet and they discuss all the possibilities of what they may do with the girls when they see them next. Rodney then asks where their phone number is, and Del reveals that it was written on the cigar packet that Rodney had thrown out of the window about a mile and a half back. In shock and anger, Del slams the brakes. Before they can say anything further, the familiar sound of screeching brakes swiftly approaches them before something slams right into the back of their car. Del and Rodney get out to investigate, only to see the same Australian chap from earlier in the death trap vehicle that they just sold him. The angered Aussie then chases them into the night, and the closing credits begin. So that was Go West Young Man. Overall, it's just another one of those typical season 1 episodes. It's not particularly bad, but it's not offensive either. but you'd be hard-pressed to say that it's an episode that immediately comes to mind when you think of classic Only Fools. And like I say, it does end in that very uncomfortably sudden season 1 fashion. You know, you're getting into the episode, you're on the night out with them, we're having fun, and the flow of the episode up until the end is it's satisfying and feels like it's progressing at a proper pace and is building up to something. And then suddenly you're shocked to hear the end credits music start to play and the audience applause, and you're like, oh, this is where it's ending? Okay. Like, what happened to Boycie in the car? Did Marlene, not that she's named Marlene yet, find out about his bit on the side? Did Del pay for the Australian man's brakes? Did he catch up with them? Did they ever get back with the girls? Like, you know, these aren't the most pressing questions in TV history when compared to things like Lost or The Wire, but it does seem a little bit too much just to leave dangling, even for a status quo-based sitcom like this. But maybe my modern mind just expects too much. What I do appreciate about this episode, though, is that it does live up to one of Sullivan's original promises for the show. It really does highlight the true diversity of a modern London. You know, rather than just being relegated to the Nag's Head and other typical old English locations that we all know and love, instead we visit trendy nightclubs filled with dancing young people. We have an active gay bar scene with cross-dressing patrons. And to top it all off, we have a growing Australian community in the London area. These characters feel very removed from a typical British sitcom at the time. Speaking of a typical British sitcom, I was just around my parents' place the other day. I actually record these episodes in my old bedroom, and I was just making some toast one morning, and my mum was watching something on the telly in the kitchen, and I just averted my attention slightly, and it was this very drab and beige, dreadfully middle-class, prim and proper, hoity-toity programme, and it had Margot from The Good Life in it. I was like, oh my god, this is actually it. This is To the Manor Born. It's so dull. I couldn't even register what it was. Just comparing the plot of what I saw there to an episode like this. This is kind of just a very stripped back, small, a day in the life of Del and Rodney type moment. And in this episode of To the Manor Born, I can't remember the episode's name, but the main plot was just about these silly rich residents complaining that their local train station was going to close down. Oh no! You know, one of these characters was so rich that he simply just had to resign himself to having to use his helicopter to get in and out of town instead. You know, this is hardly the gripping social realist depiction of contemporary life in Britain, is it? And you can understand how a show like Only Fools and Horses, about the grittier common man with a bit of cash in his pocket, really needed to come in and sweep all that under the rug. So yeah, that was episode 2. Like I've said, nothing bad, but nothing earth-shattering either. But please join us again for next week, as we're going to cover another one of the Trotters' more diverse adventures when we cover episode 3 of the season 1, Cash and Curry. I'm Sam Wiles, and you've been listening to Only Fools and Podcasts. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next time. Oh, and don't forget, this time next year, we'll have 1 million downloads.